call this meeting to order. And pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September the 18th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the protection of freedom of expression. All witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting, and so I would like to welcome our witnesses. As an individually, we have Karim Bardisi, Executive Director, the DAIS, Toronto Metropolitan University, and then Arnaud Bernadette, Associate Professor, McGill University, Father Raymond J. D'Souza, Mr. Charles Leblanc, full professor, Department of Philosophy, University of Ottawa, and National Council of Canadian Muslims, Nuzaiba Al-Azam, Director of Legal Affairs, and then Queer Momentum, Faye Johnston, Executive Director, and some of those are at video conference. We just have two people in the room, Father D'Souza and Monsieur Leblanc. And so we'll begin, and I'll just quickly tell you what the run of the show is. You each individual has 5 minutes, and if there's more than one person for a group, the group still has 5 minutes. I will give you a 30-second shout-out, literally. I will go 30 seconds, and so you're going to need to wrap up, and even if you didn't finish what you have to say, you can actually expand on it during your question and answer period. And so then we have a question and answer period in which committee members will begin to ask you questions. So I would like to begin with Karim Bardisi, Executive Director of the DAIS. For 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the committee for undertaking this important study. My name is Karim Bardisi. I'm the Executive Director of the DAIS, a policy and leadership think tank at Toronto Metropolitan University, looking at the key digital drivers to shared prosperity and shared citizenship for Canada. In this conversation and throughout the time, I'll be drawing a bit on our policy research and our opinion research that we've done in this space by the DAIS and our predecessor, the organization, the Leadership Lab at Ryerson and TMU since 2019. I understand there's particular interest in some of the freedom of expression issues as they pertain to current Canadian legislation before Parliament at the moment, so I'll touch a bit on that, in particular the Online Harms Act, which is before Parliament. We know that expression on online platforms is bounded by a few things. It's bounded by the Charter, it's bounded by potentially this prospective piece of legislation, and it's bounded by the activities of people on the platforms, as well as the choices and the algorithms of the platforms themselves. I've just come back from Washington, D.C., from a Future of the Internet Summit brought together by a number of players who are interested in this space. And the technology that is moving, that empowers the incumbent platforms, in particular the incumbent social media platforms, to be ever more choiceful about the algorithms and what's being presented to people online, continues to get more powerful. But I think it's really important for this committee to remember that the Charter is still the ultimate defender of freedom of expression, and that the Online Harms Act still has while being pretty specifically carved out to a few key sets of harms, is still in deference to the Charter. You're probably aware that the Online Harms Act refers to 7 categories of harms, with an exemption for private messaging platforms, and the remedies that are proposed in that bill, we think are by and large the right ones. The tabling of a digital safety plan and takedown provisions for the most egregious harms. We believe at the DAIS and in the civil society community that's really following this closely, that freedom of expression can very successfully coexist with this proposed piece of legislation, and that it's important that Canada looks to govern the online space appropriately in a targeted fashion while being respectful of our fundamental rights and freedoms. I'll note that Canadian public opinion in favor of action in this space is strong and growing. So some of our research finds that the desire for a legislative action to counter deepfakes is increasing now at a 68% level in our survey. And this is a survey we've done pretty much every year since 2019. The Canadians who are concerned about what's happening online, they acknowledge that it's 49% of Canadians believe it's those who are producing content online that are, 46% of Canadians believe that people who are producing content online are primarily responsible for the content, but they believe that 49% of them believe that it's the platforms themselves that have the responsibility to fix the problem. So a plurality of Canadians that people who are making the content online are responsible for the problem, but a plurality of Canadians believe that it's the platforms themselves who have a responsibility for fixing the problem. And that doesn't happen on its own. It happens through the give and take, the social license that these platforms have with their users and with the countries in which they operate. But there's also a potential role for targeted legislation. And we believe at the DAIS, based on our research, that the Online Harms Act does a good job in a targeted way of dealing with the most egregious harms and helping set up a more healthy and safe online ecosystem for everyone. I'd be ready to answer questions in English or in French. I gave my presentation in English, but happy to answer questions in English or in French.
Thank you very much. You did not use up your 5 minutes. That's great. Thank you. And now I go to Arnaud Bernadette, Associate Professor at McGill. Professor Bernadette.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I thank the members of the Standing Committee for the invitation. My name is Arnaud Bernadette, and I'm a professor in the Department of French Literature at McGill University. I'm also a member of the Observatoire sur la liberté d'expression. In recent years, my books, work, and articles have focused extensively on freedom of expression and academic freedom, the state of democratic conversation in the face of the culture wars and cancel culture. My discussion here will focus on expressive freedoms in the academic field. On the one hand, because of its particularity, since it brings into play two types of public freedoms, that is academic freedom and freedom of expression, which are distinct, but also present certain areas of intersection. Secondly, because over the last 10 years, the university has been a testing ground for what is happening in the rest of society, a renewal and even a radicalization of the culture wars, from the unbolting of statues to the tragedy at the University of Waterloo, where a course on gender theories led to a stabbing attack in June 2023. I understand how important it is for members of Parliament to consider possible legislative safeguards to protect freedom of expression. At the end of my research, it seems to me that what is currently being undermined is a culture of contradiction on which the dynamics of debate are based to the benefit of a culture of division. Often demonized, cancellation practices are perhaps less the cause than the symptom. It is important to remember that the action of canceling consists in particular for minority groups, which by definition have few means at their disposal, and reversing or rebalancing the balance of power within society, often symbolically. The scenes of cancellation are based on a triangular relationship between the target, who is denounced or ostracized, and the complainant, who applies pressure by demanding accountability from those in power. And there is a body that acts on the basis of power it holds. In the case of universities, the main culprits are the administrators themselves, who, for reasons of reputational calculation and clientelism, will give in under pressure without supporting the teaching staff, who then find themselves isolated. For example, there were lectures at the University of Lethbridge that were interrupted, and also Robert Wintermute's lectures at McGill that were cancelled or disrupted. Finally, establishments are increasingly relaying certain dangerous confusions about freedom of expression to meet the demands of their public. This was revealed by the controversy surrounding the University of Ottawa in the fall of 2020. In this particular case, we failed to distinguish between a word in use and a word in mention, reflecting on the history of a word or quoting a book title that contains a racist term as formal logic and linguistics septatus is not the same as using it. On the other hand, an even more serious confusion has arisen between hateful speech, which constitutes a firm limit on freedom of expression, and hurtful or harmful speech. If there were any legal intervention to be made, it would be perhaps to reaffirm the dividing line between these forms of speech. And to sum up, in the university, as in the public arena, what is known as cancel culture takes a variety of forms and does not necessarily translate into censorship. which presupposes the exercise of power. On the other hand, alongside vertical censorship, the classic state censorship, which is far from having disappeared, there are horizontal, particular forms of censorship, a kind of micro-coercion or micro-power, which rests on other non-state authorities, university administrators, company directors, media moderation groups, etc. It's on this side that we see the emergence of new forms of censorship. It would be naive to think that there is no link between vertical and horizontal censorship. As for the N-word, for example, there is a clear continuum between the pressure exerted by the CRTC on Radio-Canada and the pressure exerted by the administration of the University of Ottawa on one of its professors, on exactly the same grounds. Thank you very much. And I'm ready to take your questions.
Bernadette, and then I go to Father D'Souza, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the invitation to address the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage and to express my esteem for Parliament and those who serve here for the common good. Freedom of expression enjoys a prominent place in the Canadian Constitution and the fundamental freedoms of the Charter. It is listed second, along with freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and the press. Only freedom of conscience and religion has a more important place in the Charter. The Charter guarantee prevents governments from restricting expression. The usual way governments might do that is by statute, with citizens then seeking relief in the courts. I wish to highlight other methods used by governments to limit freedom of expression, methods that make it more difficult or even impossible for citizens to seek relief in the courts. This represents a new danger to freedom of expression. I offer 3 methods. The first method is the use of the government's spending power. The government might offer a benefit with conditions which limit fundamental freedoms. For example, such was the case with the Canada Summer Jobs Program when initially the federal government program required applicants to attest that they assented to the government's views on abortion. For example, a landscaping business that otherwise took no public policy positions would have to assent to the government's view of Canada's abortion license. Widespread objection led the government to revise the required attestation in implicit recognition that the original requirement violated fundamental freedoms in Section 2A and 2B of the Charter. A second danger arises from regulatory bodies which have been granted vast powers by the state. For example, professional accreditation and licensing bodies may use their power over citizens' livelihoods to restrict freedom of expression. The Jordan Peterson case has brought this to prominent attention, but the problem is older than his particular case. Medical professionals in particular face restrictions on freedom of expression as well as other fundamental freedoms for reasons of ideological conformity, not professional competence. This has been a particular problem in the healthcare field in relation to euthanasia. The third way the state might restrict freedom of expression is to establish and fund institutions which seek to restrict expression. For example, Kimberly Murray, the independent special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools, has called for so-called denialism regarding burial sites to be subject to government sanction, even criminal penalty. That would include even asking scientific questions. Having funded the interlocutor, the Attorney General at the time, this is June 2023, the Honourable David Lametti, indicated his openness to deploying the criminal law in such manner. That is government directly supporting those who wish to restrict fundamental freedoms, in fact, those whom the government himself set up and funded. It is true that Mr. Lametti was fired from the cabinet soon after that, but I don't think the two things were connected. So those are 3 non-statutory ways in which the government could restrict freedom of expression that leave less redress for citizens to go to the courts. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Very much, Father. And then I go to Monsieur Leblanc of the Department of Philosophy, University of Ottawa. 5 minutes, please, Professor.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation today. I have to admit that it's quite surprising that a country like Canada, which has an excellent constitution and that also has a charter of rights and freedoms and a tradition of jurisprudence that is authoritative, that we have to today, and has been for the case for a few years now, look at freedom of expression and study this. These are the things that should be understood. It seems to me that the first question that we should ask ourselves is, why are we in a situation today having to study these issues? What has changed in this country that means that the freedom of expression is a problem? That's the first question on the philosophical front that appears important to me. I want to emphasize two things because I don't have a great deal of time. The first is that there is confusion that exists between freedom of expression and freedom of conscience. That might seem like a trivial question if it was talked about in the highest spheres of the state. The Prime Minister of Canada and our Minister of Foreign Affairs have said that after the unfortunate story at the Bedford School in Quebec, that it was a question of freedom of expression, whereas to the contrary, if it was tied to these problems, it was one of freedom of conscience. It was not one of freedom of expression. Never would Muslim teachers hijack a school in Quebec and in the name of freedom of expression. But on the contrary, it is because of the particular concept that they had of the freedom of conscience that they did so. So we all have that freedom of conscience that founds our freedom of expression. Everything that appears important to us, our convictions, our opinions, the beliefs that we have. That's the problem is when we then have to express what is from this private domain, the beliefs that we have in the public arena, and that is when we will have difficulties that appear. The freedom of conscience is not infinite either. That is to say that in its external expression, it has certain limitations. None of us here could issue the idea that, or say that we aren't going to pay our taxes in the springtime because it harms our freedom of conscience. There are limits also to the freedom of conscience in its external expression. So to me, it seemed that there was a confusion that we often see. The freedom to believe what we wish and the freedom to say anything at all. So that's a confusion between freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. That is a thing that, in my opinion, we must come back to. The second and final point is that on academic freedom, that I will refer to as liberté universitaire, this academic freedom was presented by one of my colleagues from the University of Regina before this committee in a way that I believe created some confusion, not to criticize a witness who appeared here before me. But I think there has to be some rigor in the expression of our opinions. I took a few notes. She talks about the neutrality of the administration in terms of professors' freedom or researches, and she talks about their freedom to do these researches. She also implies that there is an unlimited and opinion with no obstacles. So it doesn't depend on my colleagues. If my colleagues in my department feel that my research in philosophy or in literature is not valid, it's not up to them to judge it. It's in doing my research that perhaps doesn't hold water that will then be set aside by the scientific community afterwards. But it's not an article that has been submitted to the assessment of my peers in terms of academic freedom. And I'll stop on the last final small point. Today in La Presse, I read an article about academic freedom and the CHPC in Quebec. And once again, there's some confusion there. The professors at CEGEP do not have academic freedom, but they have some autonomy. They have to follow a curriculum that is set out by the state and by Quebec. And of course, the professors, according to their competency, may improve the program using their educational freedom that they have. So I think that I'll be happy to answer your questions. I thank you very much.
And the National Council of Canadian Muslims, Nusaiba Al-Azem, Director of Legal Affairs. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and I'd like to thank the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage for the invitation to speak today and for all of the important work that you do. My name is Nusaiba Al-Azem. I'm the Director of Legal Affairs at the National Council of Canadian Muslims, and I'm pleased to be here today during this important study on the protection of freedom of expression during this committee. And the question of this committee and looking at the means for government to protect freedom of expression is a profound one, as it forms our major and main concern around what is, in our view, the most fundamental challenge to free expression in Canada today. Our submission is quite simple. The most pressing challenge to free expression in Canada has become the wanton use of the notwithstanding clause, that is Section 33 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, by governments across Canada to derogate from our charter rights, including freedom of expression. In our view, the overuse of Section 33 has become nothing short of a constitutional crisis. We all learned in grade school civics, even I learned in law school, that the usage of the notwithstanding clause, if used improperly to attack fundamental freedoms like Section 2 of the Charter, would mean the end of that government. I recall my professor using the words political suicide. Unfortunately, our grade school civics lessons were wrong. That professor was wrong. We at NCCM warned of this at what we viewed to be the beginning of this crisis when we went to court some years ago to challenge Bill 21 for which we currently await leave to the Supreme Court of Canada. Bill 21, of course, to us remains the enshrinement of stripping away the rights of minorities and the right to free expression and freedom of religion, backed by the notwithstanding clause, to make it so that Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs cannot freely express their faith by wearing a turban, a hijab, or a kippah, and be, for example, a public school teacher. Multiple courts in Quebec have agreed that the ban is discriminatory, but is saved by the notwithstanding clause. While NCCM and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association previously successfully went to court to stop Bill 62, which in some ways was a predecessor, which prohibited women wearing niqab for riding a bus or getting a library card in Quebec, thus far, the notwithstanding clause has become a tool raised by governments in Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Quebec as a constitutional get-out-of-jail-free card to evade judicial review. Its use has been threatened in many more provinces as well. Our recommendation to this committee is the following: that this committee begin a specific study on the appropriate use of the notwithstanding clause, because make no mistake, the very future of our federation is at risk when quasi-emergency powers become normalized in this way. Our second concern, which we view as a current fundamental risk to the freedom of expression in Canada, relates to the need to protect freedom of expression in this austere House. We support pieces of legislation that have been put forward to better protect freedom of expression, like Conservative Private Members Bill C-257 that would protect against discrimination based on political belief. We have seen too often attacks on freedom of speech against those who would speak for controversial causes, as somehow support of Palestinian human rights is regarded to be and has been over the last year. We have seen many cases, for example, of people losing their jobs for simply raising public concerns about the Israeli military invasion in Gaza. We've seen a concerted suppression of Palestinian expression and narratives, and we think that's wrong. We recommend that the government explore ways to make sure that the critique of any foreign government, whether that's Israel, China, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Russia, or India, is always protected. And I look forward to the questions of this committee. Thank you for my time.
Thank you very much. And then I go to finally but not really finally, but we go to the Queer Momentum, Faye Johnston, Executive Director. 5 minutes, please, Ms. Johnston.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, committee. My name is indeed Faye Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Queer Momentum, a national LGBTQI+ advocacy organization. And I've dedicated my career to advancing the freedom, rights, and overall equality of two-spirit, queer, and trans people in Canada. I am grateful for the opportunity to address you today within this study on protecting freedom of expression. To begin, I would invite members of the committee to reflect on the long and proud history of queer and trans people advocating for freedom, inclusive of freedom of expression. Our legacy as a country includes the criminalization of LGBTQI+ people, the denial of our human and civil rights, inaction from our government during the AIDS crisis, government-led efforts to remove us from the public service, police raids on our establishment, Canadian customs targeting our businesses, censorship of our literature, and so much more. We are a community that has been subjected to a horrifying legacy of discrimination, dehumanization, violence, and inequality that continues to this day. Those most marginalized in our community are often those whose voices are most silenced. In my work today, I stand on the shoulders of giants, of gay men, lesbians, queer and trans people, and our allies who fought and won human rights for my community. Because of those advocates, I've grown up in a Canada that is more welcoming and more inclusive. The Canada that I grew up in filled me with hope. I believe that we are on the cusp of something incredible, a Canada where we have shed our age-old hostility towards gender and sexual diversity, and we're ready to embrace a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable future, not just for queer and trans people, but for all Canadians. In the past 5 years, I've unfortunately lost that hope. I've seen the resurgence of homophobia and transphobia all across this country as part of a broader global backlash against queer and trans people. Now I am fearful of the trajectory we're headed in. I'm worried that we're headed towards a future where my community's rights and freedoms, including our freedom of expression and our overall equality, will be stripped away in a political era defined by fear, anger, and misinformation. Each year for the past 3 years, Statistics Canada has reported increases in hate-motivated violence targeting queer and trans people. CSIS has warned that the anti-gender movement, a term that describes a range of anti-LGBTQ+ groups, poses a threat of extreme violence in Canada. Across this country, drag performers, LGBTQI+ activists, Pride Festival organizers, and parents of queer and trans kids have been targeted with hate, with death threats, and other forms of harassment, both online and in real life. Rhetoric that demonizes, dehumanizes, and strips dignity away from my community has created a culture of fear amongst queer and trans Canadians. As a trans advocate, I've personally experienced the price of speaking out for my community. Last year, I was subjected to an international hate and cancel campaign for my inclusion as a transgender woman in a Hershey's Canada International Women's Day ad initiative. My participation in this campaign sparked global backlash. Figureheads of the far right and anti-LGBTQ groups, including individuals like Tucker Carlson, Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, and others, targeted me. They published my dead name, shared pre-transition photos of me, created and circulated disgusting caricatures, and otherwise directed vitriol my way. The degree of hate and risk to my safety that this backlash unleashed was such that I was accompanied by security guards for 6 days straight. Words cannot adequately convey the psychological impact of being targeted by the combined might of hate groups and far-right leaders across the country and around the world. While I am indeed an activist, at the end of the day, I am simply a young woman who happens to be trans, who is speaking up for what she believes is right. And what happened to me is unfortunately an extreme example, but one of many other examples happening to members of my community all across Canada. After the Hershey's fiasco, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at a women's rights gala in Regina. Rebel News took issue with my inclusion, and this so-called media outlet created an online petition to have me fired, powered by a website called literally www.firefaye.ca. They also published my dead name in another attempt to shame me. And as if this wasn't enough, days before the gala, a Rebel News reporter found me in a park across the street from my hotel, and she made the irresponsible and dangerous decision to publish a video disclosing where I was staying, this after weeks propagating hate and harassment towards me. And this put my safety at immediate and real risk. Rising anti-LGBTQ+ hate is both morally repugnant and a direct threat to freedom of expression. What happens when you, as a queer person or the parent of a trans kid or an ally, risk being doxxed, personally targeted, and subjected to hate and harassment if you speak out for human rights, equality, and freedom? What happens when Canadians are unable to express their political opinions or speak out on political issues without significant and potentially safety-compromising repercussion? What scares me most in Canada today is witnessing hate jump from a social phenomena into mainstream politics. In the last year, we've seen 3 governments in Canada use misleading slogans and deceptive language to sow division, normalize hate, and cue their support for anti-LGBTQ2+ groups. There is no more egregious example than what we're seeing with Premier Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, suspending the charter-protected rights of Saskatchewan children to put forward legislation that denies freedom to trans kids. This divisive rhetoric isn't happening in isolation. It has given cover for these elements of draconian legislation on the provincial level. And beyond the specific impact of the policies themselves, they've created a culture of fear. In many ways, it's akin to the don't say gay laws that we're seeing
30
in
seconds.
America, where Canadian classrooms, where teachers in classrooms, school administrators, and students themselves are afraid to mention, touch on, or talk about gender and sexuality. What happens in a country where instead of bringing people together, we normalize division and difference, with even the leader of Canada's Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, fanning the flames of conspiracy with his allusion to gender ideology. I don't have all the answers. I'm not a lawyer, but I am a Canadian committed to defending freedom, equality, and rights, because they're each dependent on each other. I believe in a Canada where my community is truly free, truly equal, and truly safe. And that cannot happen when elected officials flirt with hate. 2SLGI plus people at the end of the day are human beings, not political props to be maligned and targeted to gain power. And I urge us all to reject hate and unite in a shared vision of a better future for all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. In an answer segment, the first round is a 6-minute round, and I begin with Kevin Waugh for the Conservatives. Kevin, 6 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all 6 that have appeared here in committee this afternoon. I guess, Father De Souza, I'm going to start with you. Your primary concern right now about challenging the freedom of expression in Canada. I'm not going to talk to you about C11 or C18 or even the online harms bill. I just want to know your view on this, on the freedom of expression, your concerns. You talked about 3 issues. I'll delve into those in a moment. But overall, what is your concern?
I chose 3. The examples I chose were all examples that traditionally, in terms of defending freedom of expression, you have a government statute. And then if you think the statute's limiting your rights, you can appeal to the courts for relief. The examples I gave are ones that make that more difficult because it's not a statutory act. It's a regulatory thing. It's a spending power. And the last example was actually just creating a kind of a lobby for restricting freedom of expression. Some of the other witnesses also address things that don't fall under the realm of a government statute, so professional organizations, universities, et cetera. So that's why I chose to highlight those things. That seems to be where more of the threats to freedom of expression come today. That's why I highlighted those.
I think the one you highlighted first was interesting. It was the Canada Summer Jobs when this government demanded faith-based organizations to sign off on the attestation. My riding of Saskatoon Grasswood, I had a number of nonprofit organizations that I truly support, and many of them couldn't sign off on the attestation. And I give them credit for it. There was, I give them credit because their moral obligation, they had a moral obligation on this issue that, yes, they could have taken the money. Yes, they could have given Canada Summer students an opportunity, but many of them did not. And to me, I was very proud of them, to be honest with you. I dealt with them for many years. Like I said, my first one is nonprofits and whether in my community, nonprofits are struggling right now, and they've struggled in the past. So when they said thanks, but no thanks, that spoke a lot about the organizations, if you don't mind me saying. Just comment on that, because you did mention that off the top.
I did. I would just make a distinction. The example I used was actually not a faith-based group. It would be just a generic landscaping company. Everybody was required to make that attestation in the first instance. It does touch for some on freedom of conscience and religion, as it may have for some of the faith-based groups, but it was a requirement the requirement for that program was that you had to express an opinion. It happened to be an opinion on a specific subject in agreement with the government's policy, but the very fact that you had to express an opinion to qualify is itself a violation of freedom, thought, opinion, and belief. So that was the problem there. You're right. It put some groups in the position of having to make a difficult choice, and those who made a principled choice, I would share your view, required some courage to do so, but they shouldn't have to be in that position. The difficulty there was that redress against that was very difficult. Had it been a statute, you could have gone to court and maybe got an injunction right away. It's possible. I mean, we'd have to see whether that was possible. But when it becomes a attestation, part of the apparatus of the application process, redress was very difficult. Now, there were later some court initiatives, and then later there was a revision. But had it been, if the government passed a law saying that you had to make that attestation, you could have been in court the next day to seek relief and maybe have got, if the judge agreed, some kind of injunction. But this is a more nebulous requirement and therefore harder to seek redress.
I have three major hospitals in the city of Saskatoon. One is a faith-based Catholic hospital, St. Paul's. They don't believe in MAID, and they will not do that. And just your thoughts on that, because they've been run by the nuns in the past, and they're faith-based, they're a Catholic hospital, a very integral part, I would say, of our city. And I give them credit also on the MAID. They spoke out right away. They did not agree with this. Just your thoughts on, and there's been some backlash in our city towards them because of their position on this. But just your thoughts on that.
Well, that would, I think, would come under the primary freedom outlined in the Charter, which is freedom of conscience and religion. Freedom of expression comes in the second part of the fundamental freedoms. So I would agree that they should not be coerced against their conscience. In that case, my concern here was actually more in professional associations where what a doctor, physician, a nurse, pharmacist, whatever might even say is being policed, not because of the professional competence of that medical practitioner, but because of the view that in this case, the professional body might take. And that power is given to them by the government. So they hold that livelihood of that professional in their hands. So that's and in fact, in a way, a professional body has more power over it than maybe the provincial government, which has more blunt instruments. But to limit your livelihood is a pretty powerful power given to regulatory professional bodies. And when you seek redress against them, it's harder because courts give them more deference because of what they're supposed to be doing is professional regulation than they would to the government if the government did the same thing.
Thank you. My 6 minutes is up.
Thank you. And now I go to, for the Liberals, Talib Nur Mohammed. Mr. Nur Mohammed, 6 minutes, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I actually was I was expecting one of my colleagues to be going. I thought Michael was going first. Dr.
I'll go first. Talib. Yeah, thank you very much.
We have a list that was given to us, and so we follow the lists. And if you change your minds, can you let us know before the meeting begins? So before you do that,
Dr.
So
Fry,
who is going to speak? Michael.
That list was shared by your staff, Dr. Fry.
I know, and we have it written here. The clerk has typed it in.
I'll just go.
We will not argue, but if you are speaking now, it's not Mr. Nur Mohammed. It's you, Michael Coteau.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. All right.
I wanted to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. And, we've got many different opinions, and that's a great thing about our country is that we have the ability to express our different opinions and bring different perspectives. I think that's what makes this country a great country. If you go to any of the list of different freedoms and liberties and comparators across the globe, Canada always seems to land in the top, I would say, 3-4% of countries when it comes to liberty and freedom. And I've always thought of Canada as a place where one can express themselves without worrying about repercussions. But I do agree with Professor LeBlanc that something has changed in our country over the last decade, maybe the last 15 years, and I just wanted to perhaps go around and just to ask the question, what has changed in this country, and why are we here today having this conversation about the ability to to express ourselves? So what has changed? Maybe I'll start with Mr. Bernadette, I believe the pronunciation is. Professor?
Oui, merci pour c'est une.
Thank you. That's quite a broad question. What's changed? It's a complex question. I'd say that there are phenomena in this country that we have talked about, polarization and radicalization, which is another thing, but clearly there is a tendency that is due of an importation of the Canadian, or the American rather, perspective. We've seen that through the last elections. It's a strong influence on it. We've seen the effect of it. And we have to recognize that the U.S. is really like a laboratory. And when that's part of their soft power, they export their models to other countries. So I think that's part of it. At the same time, I'd say we have to look at it, that we talk about culture. The media are the first to export this kind of antagonism, and these are different kinds of characteristics that are reductive, and then they accuse the social media of doing such a thing, of spreading that. So I think that there is that effect as well. The third thing is that there are also currents and logics that are being put out there. We see it in the cancel culture that we're seeing. We can see it at the university. Cancel culture, you mustn't forget, is heterogeneous. It is really an argument about values. And this argument is not to look at different minority groups who want to defend certain codes, but it's to look at it symbolically. And there are some cases it can result in a kind of gagging. So people who cancel are not always those who are really protesting necessarily. If you look at what happened in Montreal, it's not those people who were protesting. They were using their right of expression, and they, with the whole Slav story, they were protesting, people who were black, not being able to play certain roles. And anyway, I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Bardisi, Karim, if you want to take a shot at that question, what has caused this change for us to even have this conversation today?
Yeah, and I want to pick up a bit on Professor Bernadette's commentary, and it's really the power of these social media platforms to target and to identify issues that resonate with people's identities or their choice of identities, and serve them content that appeals to their in-group, their identity in-group, or has them serving information, serving content that targets an identity out-group. I think is just really important to understand that the information ecosystem, the way in which we consume information, has changed so significantly. For most Canadians, Canadians are more likely to cite a social media channel rather than a non-social media channel as their main source of news these days. And so that's just that's a phenomenon that we didn't see even 5-10 years ago. And those social media channels are personalized and are serving content that is intended to speak often to one's identity or one's choice of identities, and the identities, again, of people in the in-group and the out-group. And so that reduces the shared space we have for shared conversations, for shared information, and for shared reasonable political debate.
Thank you very much. Ms. Al-Azim, did I pronounce it right? Is that correct?
Alazam, yeah, that's correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your, bringing to this group the attention around Bill 21.
Sorry, you have 3 seconds left, Mr. Coutu.
Thank you for being here.
Then I go to the Bloc Québécois, Martin Champoux. 6 minutes, please, Martin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. LeBlanc, earlier Michael Coutu asked a question that I wanted to ask you and to Professor Bernadette. He answered, and so I'm turning to you. What has changed? Why is it that we're here today discussing this issue? All of us as Canadians and as citizens of a democratic country, we are all moving backwards. We're fearful. We're showing little courage. And I'll take the example of the University of Ottawa and my rector as an absolute example of lack of courage. And I think that that is the big reason. It's because we're moving backward, and we're ready to make concessions on words, first of all. And from the moment that we make concessions on words, then we're going to make concessions on things, on concepts. Because words have meaning. A word by itself is a definition. It's going to make sense within a sentence. And if we tiptoe around the N word, there's no one in the room that doesn't know what word I'm talking about. So in my opinion, it's nothing but hypocrisy. I absolutely agree that the word as pronounced has a racist connotation, and I don't wish to hurt anyone. But when, as Camus was saying, we don't say things clearly, we add to the woes of the world. And as soon as we start withdrawing on the use of words, it's very simple. It begins with a word we won't say, and then it's a concept that we're not going to deal with, and then it's a course that we're not going to teach, and that's what's going on. And that's the next step. And then it's going to be, oh, well, I think that this session I'll take a sabbatical because I want to relax. I don't want to be in a confrontational situation all the time. So what has changed? It's us. At some point in time, you simply have to make your point and take a stand and not go back, not back down. In one of my philosophy classes, it's entitled The Great Philosophical Questions. So, Mr. LeBlanc, Madam Chair, it's very difficult to concentrate. I'm having trouble hearing the answer of my witness because there are conversations in the room. Could you ask people to respect the witness who has the floor?
If you're going to have to speak about something, can you go into a far corner of the room? It's not fair to disturb the testimony of witnesses. Thank you.
Désolé, Monsieur Leblanc. Je vous en prie, mais je suis désolé que ça vous ait dérangé.
Thank you. I'm sorry that it bothered you. As a university professor, I'm used to it, used to that kind of thing. But I would say that I gave a philosophy course that was called The Great Philosophical Questions, and I change what the questions are from year to year. So I took on the issue of the existence of God, and I gave lectures or read things that the students should read, like Goldbach, and so we arrived at the conclusion that God does not exist. So I taught that, and I had students who were diverse, to use a modern expression, and the course unfolded very well because the students are intelligent enough to know and to make the distinction between concepts that are taught and ideologies that people are attempting to push at them. I refuse to back down. I could easily have used my course on the great philosophical questions to talk about things that really weren't important. Mr. Leblanc, you mentioned, and I think Professor Bernadette also mentioned, well, you seem to really be reproaching the administrators of the institutions. And Mr. Bernadet, you spoke of it earlier, and Mr. Leblanc spoke now just about the fear that exists among professors because they're afraid to be censored in some way. So perhaps we're more fearful in the choices of issues that we want to raise with students. But there's also the administration of universities and teaching institutions that have an important role to play in this regard. And Mr. Leblanc was also emphasizing the case of Professor Duval and the lack of rigor in the defense of this professor. So is this something that you have observed in general on your side? Yes, that's absolutely the trend these days in the universities. Some administrators have defended the practice. And I'll give you an example of something that happened with Francis Witherspoon at Lethbridge University. He had to face his students with this. Now, the rector, Mac Mahoon, I think is his name, had reminded people that there could be disturbing issues raised and opinions that we didn't agree with at all. But he made a distinction that you have to make the distinction between hateful speech and speech that is hurtful, quite simply. So I can understand the problem. But there were protests that were growing a few years later, and he ended up backing down. So you might have thought that for reasons of security it would be a reason to cancel a conference, but that wasn't the case at all here. It's really the trend with the problem, and I agree with what Charles was saying. We can't, and in the university, it isn't a place where we can establish safety in terms of ethics. There are unpleasant ideas, that's clear, but we cannot, in an attempt to assure the physical safety of people, that's one thing, but emotional safety or safety in terms of ideas, it's not possible. So the great trend that the administrators are following now seems to be to bend before certain opinions that are not necessarily in the majority among the students. And I think that that really undermines everything.
New Democrats, and ask Leslie Matheson, please, for 6 minutes, Leslie. Welcome.
Lindsay, yes. That's quite all right. I appreciate being given the time here at this committee. I wanted to get right into the fact that this conversation about freedom of expression and the protection of it, I think that we need to be very careful about the legal limits to the freedom of expression and that it doesn't devolve into hate speech. Now, Ms. Johnson, you were very specific in terms of, and very clear in terms of what's occurred, what you've seen, the dangers that have existed for you because you have, because of who you are and how you identify, but the dangers that have evolved because of a great deal of extremism and hate speech coming forward. Ms. Al-Azam, you have been an incredible spokesperson in our community after the terrorist attack that happened to our London family, and I know that has come at a great consequence in many cases as well because of the dangers and the violence that you have seen, that both of you have seen, and you've both mentioned the use of dog whistle politics, of politicians using that against people in minorities, vulnerable people. And I would love for both of you to explain, because you've also both mentioned the use of the notwithstanding clause and the dangers of those uses by politicians. So I'd love to hear both of you talk about the impacts of that and the dangers of that, and the use of either Islamophobia being used for political gain or the attacks on transgender people, LGBTQ2+ folks, and what that means, the impacts on both those groups.
Who would like to go first?
Sorry, Ms. Johnson, if you could go first, and then Ms. Al-Azam.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the question. I think we are seeing, it ties into the previous question. We're in an era of polarization where I think Canadians are having a harder time paying their bills, making ends meet, and supporting their families. And when you have that environment where life is harder, it becomes easier to channel that anger and to take advantage of that anger to gain power. I think in Canada right now, we're seeing this language around, so-called parental rights, this reference to gender ideology. And so we're using these as a distraction. Instead of delivering on healthy schools and happy kids, happy families, we are trying to restrict the rights of some and create a false equivalence. This is not about parents versus kids. This is about creating a school environment where all kids have the freedom to be themselves, are treated with dignity, and raised in healthy communities. But when we see politicians engaging with this divisive rhetoric, it cues to that playground bully that they can do the same. It encourages people to walk up to and sometimes cross that line. And I think we've seen that across Canada with the rise of anti-2SLGI plus hate. In particular, the use and the preemptive use of the notwithstanding clause gives me great concern. I think in Saskatchewan, prior to allowing a court to review and to look at the policies of Premier Moe, we saw this clause used. And it actually means that one of the few checks and balances on government is now overridden. And it creates an environment where, again, we're not able to have the conversations that are nuanced, that do require expert input on the best interests of kids and the best interests of families. It becomes a whack-a-mole or a sledgehammer using a slogan to ram through legislation and policies that restrict the freedom of trans kids and their families. I think every day about the kid who isn't fortunate enough to be safe at home, who has their one space where they're able to be themselves, their school, taken away by a government that is pretending to be invested in the well-being of families, but is actually cueing their support to an anti-LGBTQ lobby that wants to take my rights away and force my community back into the closet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And the question is on impact, so I'll answer it in two parts. First, the impact of the law of Bill 21, and then the impact of the notwithstanding clause. So just to give us context about what we're talking about, we have a law that says that Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs who wear religious symbols cannot become teachers in Quebec, right? That's the law. So the impact of this was explained both in court and in a study that followed our court appearance, right? So a report found that 1 in 5 Muslim women in Quebec have experienced physical threats or aggression at work, and 54% of Quebec Muslim women have heard racist or prejudicial remarks about their religious identity from their colleagues at work, as compared to 9% of the general population. When we were in court, the court heard from many witnesses as to the harms they endured. Women teacher candidates, most of them Muslim, lost their jobs and vocations. An aspiring Crown prosecutor had their plans derailed. I know of people on personal levels who have been impacted by the bill. Individuals expressed concern about their financial security, fears for the future of their children, and many Muslim women described increasing incidents of verbal and physical harassment against them in public spaces. One woman, overcome with emotion, simply wept on the stand as she described how it felt to be excluded from a society that she had once been seen as a model of acceptance. So that's when we're talking about impact of Bill 21. When we talk about the impact of the notwithstanding clause, I mean, it's clear in just looking at how readily other provinces are now to either use or threaten the use of this clause to pass populist legislation. Wielding this power in this way threatens the very fabric of our rights, reducing them from inalienable fundamental human rights to mere permissions that are granted and taken away at whims. So that's kind of an impact. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. There's been a lot of work done on anti-Palestinian racism and how that's fallen into this idea, this rubric around hate speech and challenging the norms around or the idea of being able to and you, I think, Ms. Al-Azam, you specifically referenced that in your testimony about those fired from jobs because of it. Could you give some examples of that further examples of that and the dangers of what that means over the past year? Can you talk about Palestinian suppression as well as a...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. So this committee has heard many people in other sessions as well, such as, for example, Dr. Yapangi, for example, providing firsthand accounts of some of what we call this Palestine suppression. And for my role at NCC, I'm hearing from Muslim Canadians and other Canadians across the country. I've seen instances about regarding Palestine suppression from disproportionate police response at protests, including physical force against pregnant women who were doing nothing more than peacefully participating in a protest, as is their right, to censorship of Palestinian content online, whether that's being shadow banned or other forms of online suppression, to such egregious suppression as folks who have lost their jobs, as you made reference to, and their livelihoods for either being Palestinian, speaking in support of Palestine, or I've seen some cases literally of just quoting scripture or speaking in Arabic, and they have lost their jobs as a result. These are real cases that we've seen here in Canada from real, that's what's happening on the ground. And we've seen lawyers publicly advocate that students shouldn't be employed. We've seen forced attestation letters to make students distance themselves from student movements. And as the Superior Court of Justice found earlier this year, the fears around the risk of a new form of McCarthyism are not without foundation. That this has serious implications for the robustness of what our expression freedoms mean, what they mean, and what they mean for people who hold them, right? And this is all kind of linked into this greater...
Thank you. Can we wrap up?
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you, Ms. Matheson. The second round, which is a 5-minute round, and I begin with Mr. Kurak for the Conservatives. Damien, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Father D'Souza, thank you for your testimony. I know you've written extensively across a whole host of different topics, and I'd ask your input, if you could, about how, as Canadians, we ensure that the public sphere in this country is one where we can have robust dialogue, have debates and discussions, and be able to use the old expression, sometimes just agree to disagree, as I would suggest is one of the foundational elements of what a free and democratic society should look like. Could you comment on that?
Well, there are parts of our common culture where that's not unusual. So our newspapers, our airwaves, and it's been mentioned by other speakers, online is almost everybody can say anything that they want, and there's very little restriction on it, although there's some concerns that have been raised in some legislation. But there are areas of our common culture, a common life, where that is shrinking. We've had two professors talk about the environment on campus. There is the professional bodies that I spoke about. There are other places where the freedom to speak out is under pressure or even restricted. So you have to figure out which part of the culture you're looking at. I mean, I'm a newspaper columnist. There's no problem. I write whatever I want. I don't have any obstacle to that. But there are places and professionals in our country, professors, university professors in some circumstances, medical professionals and so forth, where there's a problem. And then there's this other issue of, do people feel kind of chilled or under pressure, which, depending on the issue, can be more of a cultural thing that doesn't have a legal expression. So are there concerns? I think there are concerns, but they're not widespread. We don't have to worry about freedom of the press disappearing in Canada. But there are places, important places in our common life together, especially professional places, where it's under restriction.
Thank you for that. Now, as a man of the cloth, you're walking this line. Your faith is a big part of your public life and the opinions that you share in that regard. So I'm wondering if, and you mentioned the prioritization in the Charter about freedom of religion and conscience and then freedom of expression. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on how key it is to ensure, in this case, lawmakers sitting around this table, but the larger context for Canadians that might be engaged in this subject, to ensure that when we talk about freedom in Canada, it not be lost in the need to take into account that freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and how that impacts freedom of expression.
Well, thank you. Well, there's a list in the charter. They could have written it any different way. That's how they chose to write it. Is that the first freedom there is conscience and religion, as Professor LeBlanc mentioned. The conscience and religion actually is where those ideas often form that then are expressed in thought, religion, belief, etc. So, if you don't protect the inner sanctuary of the person, then it's very hard to protect the outer expression of the person. That's why it's not accidental that it's there first. They're not optional, and there is a hierarchy. I mean, they're all fundamental freedoms, but there's a reason that was chosen. And when we come to our public life together, people of faith should not feel that somehow, because their views on a particular public issue are formed in their faith, they're somehow secondary, or they're somehow less worthy of contribution, as if a secular idea somehow has greater validity because of its origin. So that's not usually a legal problem, but it is often the case, even in our public debates, that arguments that proceed from conscience and religion are sometimes treated as second-class arguments.
I appreciate that. And just one last quick question. I think I have about 30 seconds. Is that right? There are some that would suggest that specifically when it comes to discussions surrounding faith, and I hear this from pastors and priests and other faith leaders, that they're worried that there are some within our society that would say you're free to say what you want within your church, but don't take it outside the doors of that church. Is that an express? Is that what the charter means?
Means, because that would be like saying you're free to think what you want in your classroom or in your barber shop or in your bar or tavern or in your house, but you can't bring that into public life. People don't say that. So there shouldn't be sort of a special category that says if that's what you think in your temple or church or mosque, that's not allowed. That's not what freedom of religion or conscience. That's not what freedom of expression means.
Thank you.
I do not know which liberal witness I have next. I think it's Mr. Noor Mohammed, but I stand to be corrected.
Nope, that is correct, Madam Chair. Thank you. I was struck by a number of the comments that were made today about the importance of freedom of expression, particularly when it comes to matters of faith. And Ms. Alazim, when you spoke, one of the things that you didn't touch on, and I'm wondering if you could, was the chilling impact on freedom of expression of Muslim women during the time when the Conservatives proposed a ban on the niqab not long ago. Can you share your views on the sort of the propriety of a ban like that and what it actually does when it comes to freedom of expression nationally?
Certainly, and I thank you for the question. It in many ways builds on what we were just hearing about, how freedom of conscience kind of is the beginning and the inward thought, and then freedom of expression is how that ends up manifesting. And that's in fact what Quebec court found on Bill 21, was that it not only violated freedom of religion, but also freedom of expression. And so any of these, any bill that seeks any legislation that seeks to prevent effectively Muslim women or folks from being able to express their religious identity while participating in public life is certainly something that NCCM feels very strongly against, in particular in a robust democracy where everybody has the ability to be able to participate as a full member in all facets of public life. And I will just note on that NCCM did support the challenge to that legislation successfully at the time in 2015. And were we ever to see something like that in future, we would, of course, also look to litigate and look to challenge that, because we think that's fundamentally contrarian. And as I understand it, we've been in many conversations with, at the time it was a Conservative government that passed that, and we've been in many conversations with Conservative MPs who, as I understand, whose views have really evolved on that matter since then, which gives us some reassurance. And, we're happy to continue to work with all members from, across all aisles to make sure that everybody has the ability to fully show up, as themselves in all areas of public life.
Thank you. Father D'Souza, would you agree that something like a niqab ban would be ill-advised?
One in Quebec, my view is that that was not a legitimate restriction of religious liberties. That did apply, as principally as the witness mentioned, to Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs. But it actually applied to everybody. Christians have less prominent symbols, but it did apply to everybody. And I think, for example, the police force in Montreal, quite recently, in the last few years, prohibited some of their presumably Catholic members from wearing a St. Michael emblem or something like that. So, I think that that you should be accommodating to people's religious expressions. There might be some things where you might say in very specific circumstances there might be need for limitation, but that would be, I think, hard to imagine, and certainly not on a general level. So in terms of limiting people's religious expression in terms of clothing, I thought I was against that.
Thank you. If I could just go back to Ms. Al-Azam for a second. One of the things that continues to become more and more pervasive as we are seeing the Gaza-Israel war continue is the idea that somehow freedom of expression, regardless of which side of this conflict you sit on, that somehow we now need to do a better job of policing what is reasonable in terms of expression, in terms of how people respond to the tragedy and horror that is currently unfolding. What are your views on those restrictions on freedom of expression?
Sorry, can you just clarify, like, their expressions for protests, or?
Well, I know, people, whether it's workplaces, whether it's peaceful protests, and I'm not for any moment condoning violence, just so we're clear.
Of course, yeah.
Because that seems to be, we seem to conflate these things. But whether it's in the workplace, whether it's positions that are taken, whether it's conversations, and this, by the way, it applies equally to members of the Jewish community who feel afraid to express what they are, and certainly members of the Muslim community, others who have been speaking out for the Palestinian cause. How do we navigate this in a very fraught environment? How do we hear each other? Yeah,
so I think that this is kind of we're coming to the heart of the question that people have been raising here at this session and in other sessions of, how do we agree to disagree, or how do we have conversations? And it really is just about, there is a legal framework for when speech crosses a boundary that we have all determined to be criminal, to incite hate, to be speech that otherwise needs to be regulated. And for the most part, most people are aware and alive to the fact that for speech can be, for example, hurtful but not necessarily hateful, can be lawful but awful, right? And that's something that is.
Thank you, Ms. Al-Azam. I'll ask you to wrap up, please. Thank you.
Okay, just responsible leadership really is where I was going with that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we then go to who do we go to next? I keep chopping and changing this list. Who's next? No, Martin, it's not you. Yes, it's Martin. Okay, sorry, Martin. Your name is not here.
5 minutes. 2 minutes et demi.
Martin, go ahead.
Merci. Seulement 2 minutes et demi.
Thank you. Just 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. LeBlanc, when we were talking about Bill 21, I think there's a lot of misinformation and propaganda that we hear in terms of the Quebec's legislation. You yourself talked about the freedom of conscience, and Father de Sousa also talked about that and said that it applies to all religions. There are some that are more blatant symbols or more visible symbols than others. So I'd like to know if indeed the freedom of conscience can or must take precedence over the values of a society, values that have been democratically voted on. I'd like to hear your perspective on this, because all of the foolish things that have been said over the last few years and weeks and years about this bill, and I'd like to hear your perspective on it. Well, the use of freedom of expression in this committee, I'll say first of all that I'll come back to the clause, the notwithstanding clause. There isn't one in Saudi Arabia. There's no notwithstanding clause in Iran. There's no notwithstanding clause either in China. And do you know why? Because they're dictatorships. And we in Canada have a notwithstanding clause because we are a democracy. So we're not going to start saying that the notwithstanding clause is bad in and of itself. We can discuss the usage of it, but in and of itself, it's not bad. And I'll come back to your question as to Bill 21. I think being a Christian faith, I would say that conscience is fundamental. This is an inviolable space, but we live in a society and we have to know where we stand. So I've just come back from teaching for a month in Poland, where I really bent to respect the cultural taboos of that country. And I think that within a society, when there is a vast democratic consensus, there's something that we have to do, and that is to respect that democratic consensus if we are Democrats. Well, if we're not Democrats, that's another story. But if we are, we have to respect that. And not everything within a democracy suits us, but that is how it works. So as to Bill 21, it's a concession that's been made. It's not true that people are fired because they wore a hijab. Those who already had hijabs were grandfathered, and they could continue to wear it. And it was only limited to certain very specific categories that represent the state. For the others, there was no problem. Do I have 2 minutes remaining, Madam Chair?
Lindsay? Sorry, Lindsay. I don't know why I'm calling you Leslie.
I don't know either. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Johnson, I just wanted to, I have a short period of time, but I wanted to ask 2 questions. Do you currently think that our hate speech laws are sufficient? And about 7 years ago, our gender identity and expression laws were changed to add protected grounds under the Canadian Human Rights Act, which means gender identity and expression were no longer legal reasons to discriminate folks. Do you think that limiting someone else's ability to spout hate speech has improved your rights?
I think that, the passage of C-16 was an incredible moment celebrated by queer and trans people across this country. I think that we have seen improvements in terms of exceptions to inclusion and equality since that change. When it comes to hate speech laws, I would say, to me, I am not a lawyer. I am not going to imagine that I have the legal expertise to assess what does or doesn't constitute hate speech. And so what I would say rather is that I think there is dangerous speech in our social and political environment, and that is becoming more normalized. And that's harder to manage when it's not a politician, a public figure, or a far-right figurehead explicitly engaging in hate, but where they're creating a culture where that hate is more normalized, where the environment is poisoned against members of certain communities. And so I think that is the space where we actually need moral leadership from our politicians, from our political party leaders, to actually choose to unite Canadians, to protect these fundamental rights, and to understand that what's at stake here isn't just one community. I'm here to support the rights of trans and queer people, but I also fundamentally believe that Canada is a better place where we respect when we respect our neighbors and see their humanity, even if their lives and families look different than ours. I think that's fundamentally what's at stake here. And so, yes, there might be some space to strengthen hate speech laws, but it's the moral leadership that we need in this moment from our members of Parliament.
Have a minute?
There was some confusion, if I could go back, just in terms of what one of the witnesses, or 2 of the witnesses, had said in terms of Bill 21. And Ms. Azam, you had talked about women wearing hijab being fired, and yet there was a contradiction there. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. Could you clarify that in terms of what you had said?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity, because I do think there was a misrepresentation made here in that, making it seem that hijabi wearing women would be grandfathered in and therefore it's not a problem. To be clear, they would be grandfathered into their particular role only if they were hired before the passage of the bill, meaning nobody had an opportunity to enter that labor market since the passage of the bill, and that there was no opportunity for growth in their position since the passage of the bill. You could not be promoted. You could not be moved laterally. You could not decide suddenly that, I actually think I would like to, my career, I think I have more skills in XYZ area, so let me see. There was no movement because it was strictly the position that you had at the time of the bill's passage. So I think that's a little bit of a misrepresentation to make it seem like it's very much like that there was opportunity. And to be clear, the facts of the ground are that indeed it did impact the vocational aspirations and abilities of Muslim women, and other minorities, and that's why a lot of minorities in Quebec have started to leave, in fact, Quebec, in order to at least create some kind of economic security for their families and for their children. So just I thank you for the opportunity to clarify.
Thank you again.
About that grandfather.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Around, and we begin with the Conservatives. Damien Kurek. Damien, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And it is certainly appreciate the opportunity to have what is a wide-ranging discussion. And I would suggest that there's been a showcase of what freedom of expression is in Canada by the fact that in some cases divergent opinions can sit around the table and discuss civilly these very, very important issues. I would, however, Madam Chair, and I will move a motion here in just a moment, but in follow-up to the discussion that we had at this committee meeting this morning when it comes to the situation when it comes with CBC and the fact that in the last fiscal year, the CBC awarded more than $18 million in bonuses to the to executives, managers, and other out-of-scope employees at that organization, and how it is unbelievable that at a time when Canadians are suffering, that would be the attitude, to which we heard this morning no regret, no offers of dealing with that in a way that would acknowledge the challenges that are put forward. So with that, I hope that we can deal with this expeditiously and simply make the clear statement that when it comes to Ms. Tate and the bonuses that she may get, the severance package that is, it sounds like, is forthcoming for her, I would like to move the motion that was put on notice on Monday, November 18th, that is simply as follows: that the committee report to the House that it calls on the Liberal government's Privy Council office to not approve any bonuses, performance pay, or severance package for the outgoing president and CEO of the CBC, Catherine Tate. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Go ahead. Mr. Kurek, speak to your motion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, and to just highlight how it's a straightforward motion. It highlights how it is unbelievable that even today, Ms. Tate refused to rule out accepting bonuses, calling her tenure as CEO of the national broadcaster a success, refusing to take responsibility for so many of that organization's failures, and how I think it is this committee has an opportunity to show Canadians that that sort of abuse of tax dollars is simply not acceptable. So with that, Madam Chair, it's what I would suggest is pure and simple common sense. Failure should not be rewarded with big bonuses. Therefore, the motion simply expresses that opinion to the House in a straightforward manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Any discussion on this motion? No? Well, then shall we call the... Sorry? Whose hand is up? Oh, sorry. Anna?
Yeah, I was just wondering if we could suspend for a moment on this.
A minute, so you can discuss this amongst yourselves.
Yes, please.
Bye.
Thank you.
one had put up their hand. Is somebody else putting up their hand? Mr. New Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Whatever our views of Madame Tate may or may not be, there are a couple of things that are important to note. One is that she's ending her term at a normal juncture as per appointment. There's no exit package. There's no severance. I mean, this is a matter of public record. We also have heard time and again and discussed time and again the independence and the importance of independent CBC and the independence of the board. To put this committee in a situation where we are all of a sudden dictating the terms of compensation and directing the Privy Council office on the terms of compensation for independent Crown corporations sets a very dangerous precedent. Whether or not we like the performance of Madame Tate, whether or not we like the performance of the CBC, whatever the story may be, we have a role as parliamentarians, and running the Crown Corporation is definitely not it, and certainly not deciding the compensation of that of any Crown Corporation, however we may feel about it. So while I appreciate what Mr. Couric is seeking to do, I will certainly be voting against this motion because of the very dangerous precedent that it seeks to set in terms of parliamentary committees determining and dictating and instructing independent Crown corporations on compensation.
Any other person wishing to debate this? If not, I will call the vote. Sorry, whose hand is
Hands up, Chair.
I can't see. Oh, Michael, sorry.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I agree with my colleague. We have all taken a position on this committee that that the CEO should reconsider the so-called bonus packages. We've had 5 meetings with the CEO. I've expressed my specific concern around the fact that when I think what I said back then was that it doesn't sit well with Canadians to issue a bonus structure when so many people are struggling, and we were very clear about that. But to ask a committee to intervene specifically on a compensation package for CBC is just, it doesn't seem like this is the right step for a committee to take, because in the long term, this just sets us off in a direction where politicians are going to be entering a space where clearly this is the role of the bureaucracy and the folks within it, and of course the minister responsible. So I will be voting against it, but I need to be on record saying that I do think that CBC should reconsider their entire compensation package when it comes to those bonuses, and I will be voting against this motion.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands up, I will call the vote. Please, Clerk.
And the vote is on the motion of Mr. Couric. Mr. Nur Mohammed.
No.
Mr. Coteau.
No.
Madam Dillon.
No.
Madam Gainey.
No.
Mr. Lewis.
Against.
Mr. Waugh.
Yes.
Mr. Bragdon.
Yes.
Mr. Couric.
Yes.
Madam Goodridge.
Yes.
Mr. Champoux. Madam Matheson.
Yes.
That's 5 yeas, 5 pour, 6 nays, 6 contre.
The motion is not carried. So we'll move back into the using up. I think we're supposed to end this at 35 minutes after the hour because we started late matin.
Je voudrais demander, avec l'accord du comité, Madame la Présidente, comme on
I would like to ask with the committee's permission, because we started with an in-camera that we lost time there. I'd like to have 2 full hours with the witnesses. Do we have the resources to do so? Do we have them?
Until 1:45. I was going to suggest a 2-minute round for everybody. That would eat up the time till 5:35, but we'll check.
Chair, I don't want to extend the time.
For that input, do we have time?
It'll take me some time to check and confirm it.
Why do we have time to check? No, don't suspend. Okay. Can you tell me now? Check. So I'm going to go to, I would like to maybe, in case we're told no, I would like to go to a 2-minute round for everybody. And so that would start with, who would go with the Conservatives? Well, you had Damien, so it would be Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Madam Chair, I am happy following this. Mr. Kirk just had a full round,
Well, you have a full round, and then we
round.
go to the 2 minutes after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, 2.5.
2.5.
Yes,
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'd like to, first of all, go to Ms. Johnstone, because I think you have a lot to contribute to this conversation that we haven't yet heard. One of the things that has troubled me is that there has been a consistent pattern among the Conservative Party of voting against the rights of 2S LGBTQI plus Canadians, whether it was the consistent sort of votes against conversion therapy or running a candidate in the by-election right now in Cloverdale, Langley City that has said, quote, "You can pray the gay away." These types of tropes, these types of ideas that trans people have mental health disorders, which is a quote from the Conservative Party convention in 2023, in my view, while expressions of while people are using their freedom of expression, I think have a profoundly negative impact on the LGBT community. Can you share a little bit from your work of what you have seen when politicians engage in rhetoric like that and put their names on ballots? What message that sends?
Absolutely. You know, I have been disappointed to see the trajectory of Canada's Conservative Party in recent years. I remember, I think it was Michelle Rempel and it was Deputy Leader Melissa Lanceman, who have both been proponents of bringing the Conservative Party into the 21st century and shedding this legacy of homophobia and transphobia. And I miss those days. I remember seeing that evolution when marriage equality, when a opposition to marriage equality was removed from the Conservative Party policy book. And then I looked on with dread when at their last convention, we saw 2 anti-trans policies passed with overwhelming support and no conservative members of parliament speaking out in opposition. We've seen no conservatives speak out with Premier Smith denying healthcare access to trans kids and their families, with her government literally putting itself between parents and the healthcare that their kids need. And so the impact is, folks living in fear, the reinforcement of stigma and shame, and many generations of queer and trans people grew up in schools and communities that taught us to hate ourselves. And it's only in the last decade that we've seen that shift. But now this period of backlash is recreating that environment of stigma, of hostility. And, I can't stop thinking about the mom in Alberta who might have to leave her province to get her kid access to healthcare. I can't help think about the kid in Saskatchewan who simply wants to be themselves and is hearing a schoolyard bully parrot the language of their premier in order to mistreat and bully that child. And so I hope that the Conservative Party comes into 2024 and stops taking issue with my community who simply want to be ourselves, to contribute to society and make Canada a country where freedom includes everybody.
You talk about freedom, and I would love your thoughts, because this is something that I have never really understood. Why are conservatives so triggered by pronouns?
I wish I knew. I think, there is often this oversimplification. I'm stumped, honestly. I'm stumped on why. At the end of the day, it is it's basic dignity and basic respect. I like to joke. I have a trans spouse and I've screwed up their pronouns and we still got married. The world did not end. People make mistakes, but what's happening right now is they're trying to use these as wedge issues. They're trying to use these to propagate fear and to create this illusion that we're pushing an agenda. My agenda is the same agenda that gay people and trans people have been pushing forward for generations. And that is one where society stops discriminating against us, where we stop experiencing socioeconomic disadvantaged. There's nothing radical about that agenda. There is simply the idea of extending this dream of what Canada can be to include a new group of Canadians.
Well, I mean, I would argue that it isn't a question of new or old. I mean, I think if we're all equal and we all have the right to be who we are, some people have the right to be ignorant. Some people have the right to do whatever they feel. I guess the question at the end of the day, and I know that there are some really good people on this committee, and I from all parties, and I do enjoy serving with them. What would you say to them? What would you say to them as an opportunity to go back to their party leadership and members of their party who have increasingly taken positions that are certainly anti-trans? And it's an easy community to bully, right? It's a small community, and you've historically been part of a community that's not had the same protections and freedoms afforded to you. What would you say to them? What would you say to them on behalf of kids, on behalf of adults, on behalf of members of the trans community? Who just want to be left alone?
I would say speak with us and don't speak over us. I would say listen to the voices of trans people and understand what's at stake. There are many conservatives who I think are reticent around this direction for the party. And I think that many don't understand what's really going on here. There is a powerful anti-LGBT lobby. It's tied into a powerful anti-choice lobby. And they're trying to use trans people as a scapegoat to mess with access to reproductive health care, to legitimize government putting itself between, again, young people or families or everyday Canadians and healthcare that social conservatives simply disagree with. They're using trans people and anti-trans rhetoric to normalize overriding the Charter protected rights of Canadians. That includes, yes, queer and trans people. That also includes workers. That includes racialized Canadians and people of various faiths. And so I hope that folks understand what is at stake here, because yes, it's my community's equality and rights. But if you allow one community to be stomped on in an environment polluted by hate speech, it takes away the rights of everybody.
And in the last minute that I have left, or short less than the minute that I have left, I would like to go back to Ms. Al-Azam. You've just heard
Mr. Nur Mohammed, you do not have a minute left. You at 5 minutes. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going to go to Mr. Shampoo for 2.5 minutes.
Professeur Bernardet, tantôt, on a parlé.
Professor Bernardet, earlier we talked about the fears of the university administrators and professors who don't feel sufficiently supported, and the fact that students who are too sensitive feel the need to protest against things that are not in their values. You talked about artistic creations that also were subject to public pressure that even resulted in the cancellation of performances like Slav and Kannada. You mentioned those earlier. So it's the organizers who, in fact, canceled everything. They're the ones who took the decision to not continue with these productions. So are we not seeing the same phenomenon? That is, artists who censor themselves to be able to face this burgeoning protest, and because they are offended, their sensitivities are offended. So don't we have the same thing in the artistic world as what you're seeing on the academic front? I'd like to hear you on that. I know it's not, you don't have a lot of time, but it's an important issue. You are on mute, Professor. Oh, we still can't hear you. I think that there's a button on your headset, perhaps, as well. There. Okay, now you're back. So we could put the timer back to 0. So yes, I was saying that it's difficult. It's not the same environments. In the artistic area, there's a form of demoralization or politicization, I think, and that's not new, but these are movements that are quite normal. It's a kind of aesthetic. But if there is a place of freedom of expression, it would be in the artistic world. But on the other hand, we can see what problems exist, that is the fears regarding different forms of literary or artistic expression, where there are questions that are asked. We don't have the same perspective that we had 30 years ago. So there's been a mutation, and it seems normal to me. So the question really is the sharing of texts that perhaps are inspired by pedophilic activity. So is that hateful, or is that inciting that kind of behavior that could result in lawsuits? So, but yes, I think it's difficult to put those two things on the same level. Thank you very much.
2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Johnson, I wanted to ask, we've seen a lot of, and you spoke to it, many others have spoken to it in different ways, just about the leadership that is shown by specific politicians, and that linking the walking up against that sort of that line of what is hate speech, what is freedom of expression, the using of certain language, how that's adopted, how from certain far-right hate groups there are those dog whistles. It speaks to them, and it may not be outright, but it exists there. Can you talk about the impact that that's had, what you've seen in terms of walking that line? We see it often in social media. We see it as politicians ourselves and how it's used against us, but how we show the leadership to fight against that as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think often we use simple language because it resonates with the public and it's easy. And so we have this ability to use a term like parental rights. And it creates this environment where, we're therefore opposed to parental rights, which is far from the truth. And so it takes nuance out of the conversation, and I think it forces us into a black or white equation where it's us versus them. And that is actually where a lot of danger comes in. I think that is what contributes to this environment of polarization, this environment where people's dignity and human rights is becoming a political issue when they should just be a baseline. And so I think we are seeing, conservative politicians, in particular Premier Smith in Alberta, but also I would say Mr. Poilievre federally, using this language because he knows it won't, it'll go over the heads of many folks who hear that term and it resonates with them and think, yes, of course, who wouldn't support the rights of parents? But this anti-LGBT lobby is hearing that language and they're saying, oh, this guy's in our camp. He's going to back us up. And they're going to go knock on doors and they're going to then expect Poilievre to deliver on their issues and their priorities. And that agenda is one that sees regression on my rights, on my freedom, and sees a Canada where parents of LGBTQ kids have to be worried about putting their kid on the bus, about getting their kids health care, about their kids being safe to grow up and as healthy, thriving adults.
That distraction, what does it accomplish at the end of the day?
I think it takes away from the issues that most people want our governments to act on. My priorities in Canada from our federal government are action on housing, affordability, and healthcare. And when politicians have a hard time delivering on those issues and don't have solutions to the big problems facing Canadians, they dabble with this divisive politic. They dabble with these wedge issues because they don't want to answer questions on their real solutions, the priorities that Canadians have and want to see their government act on.
Johnson, very much. And now I go to Ms. Goodridge for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to really quickly, because I have very little time, cut right to it. Father D'Souza, do you believe government should be censoring speech?
Generally, no. There are obviously certain things like in national security issues, and we have quite a complicated jurisprudence in Canada about hateful speech. Some other witnesses made distinctions there, but I think generally no. That's why we have the Section 2B of the Charter.
OK. Alors, Monsieur Leblanc, est-ce que vous pensez que
Mr. Leblanc, do you think that the government should be responsible for censoring speech? No. I don't think that's the term you really want to use. I would agree with Father D'Souza that there are eagles who oversee what is hate speech and things that attack the dignity of people and attacked concepts of equality. So I think we already have the tools we need for those things. And in a democracy that functions, we have to promote debate and exchanges that are as open as possible, not only in the universities, but everywhere. And so do you think that the Liberal government is going too far with this? Well, you might have to ask that question of the Liberal government.
Liberal government has gone too far in censoring speech here in Canada.
Well, the first of the three examples I meant was that I used was a case where I think they were in error in limiting freedom of expression. The third example I mentioned was not, it was a perspective, a recommendation from a committee that they set up that seemed to meet with approval, but they haven't acted on that. But if they did, that would be improper in my view.
Thank you. I really appreciate the ability to have a diversity of views. We've had a variety of people with a variety of different views, and yet we've managed to have a civil conversation at this meeting. For the most part, there have been some slightly less civil comments made. But I think this just goes to show that we don't need government to set the regulations and limit what people can and can't say, and that can be left to different mechanisms.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Andrew Dillon for the Liberals. Andrew, 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm going to share my time with MP Lewis. My question is for Mr. Bardisi. You spoke about the growing demand from Canadians to work on regulating online harms, and that it's the responsibility of the platforms to make sure no one is harmed. Can you talk to us a little bit about the legislation very quickly, because it has to go, the next question, to my colleague, and also about foreign interference. I know it's huge. Please, as quickly as you can.
Yeah, Bill C-63 has provisions for the tabling of a digital safety plan by the major platforms, and we think that's an appropriate measure that helps them share their plan in a manner that we can understand for dealing with some of the online harms. And foreign interference is a large issue that definitely is something that threatens freedom of expression here in Canada. If we have foreign interference in elections and people are fearful of using their voices in Canada, that's a real problem.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. I'll continue with Professor Bardisi. You mentioned you just came back from a conference in the States. What are the responsibilities of the social media companies? What specific measures should the social media companies take to prevent hate speech without infringing on free speech? Because you mentioned that people are seeing, getting their news more and more from social media, but we control what we write on social media. We don't control what we read on social media.
Yeah, and so part of that is having strong trust and safety teams with humans on those teams that are complementing whatever technology that they're using to help screen for inappropriate content, or in the case of Canada, content that would be in defiance of the proposed Online Harms Act. There's lots of measures that can be taken by platforms to be more transparent around the way their algorithms work, and to help individuals shape those algorithms themselves more, rather than just you being presented with, this is the way your feed is going to work. There are some platforms that are now experimenting with measures and approaches that put more of the ability to curate what you see in the hands of the user rather than in the hands of either an algorithm or the company itself. And we think that's definitely progress.
Meeting to a close, but I would like to thank the witnesses for coming and sharing some very, very interesting and complex answers to our questions, because none of this is black or white, as Ms. Johnston said. It's all complex. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience while we voted. And so I will now adjourn the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.